The arena was alive with the noise of thousands of voices, a cacophony that could shake the very walls of the grand stadium. The Empire's soldiers lined the outer edges of the vast Colosseum, watching in silence as the apex predator stood chained at the center, its towering frame casting an ominous shadow. The ground beneath it trembled with every movement, each step a reminder of the destructive force it held. A creature bred for war, a symbol of the Empire's superiority. The humans gathered in the stands, mostly cadets and officials, all there to witness the spectacle. This was their world, a world ruled by control, a world where everything had its place, the predators, the prey, and those who would fight to keep things the same. Liora stood in the shadows, her gaze fixed on the scene unfolding before her. She wasn't like the others. The cadets around her were eager, hungry for power and recognition. They thrived on the violence, the thrill of seeing creatures fight for the Empire's glory. But Liora had always believed that there was more to these creatures than just killing machines. They had been bred to fight, to obey. But what if that wasn't their only purpose? What if they could choose? She turned her attention back to the apex predator, its dark eyes scanning the arena, its muscles rippling beneath its scales. It was a force of nature unlike any other. The Empire had bred this creature, genetically enhanced to be a perfect weapon, an unstoppable force that could lay waste to anything in its path. And today it was being tested. Today it was to fight against a human cadet, a cadet who would face the apex predator with nothing more than their wits and a weapon, a challenge set by the Empire itself. But Liora couldn't help but wonder, what if the creature didn't want to fight? What if it had a different destiny than the one the Empire had given it? The general's voice echoed across the loudspeakers, announcing the beginning of the match. "Cadet Zane, report to the arena. The apex predator awaits." Liora's heart skipped a beat. Zane was a top cadet, known for his ruthless efficiency and his ability to dominate in combat. He had been chosen for this test by the Empire, and he would do what was expected of him: destroy the predator, prove the Empire's control. But in Liora's mind, Zane's victory would prove nothing. The Empire's power was built on control and obedience, not on the strength of individuals. And that was where the flaw lay. The gates of the arena opened, and Zane stepped forward, his silhouette framed by the harsh lights. He held his weapon in hand, his face set in a mask of determination. But Liora saw something else in his eyes: fear. Not the kind of fear that came from weakness, but the kind of fear that came from knowing that the Empire's system was not as unshakable as they believed. Zane was afraid of what might happen if the apex predator broke free from its chains, if it chose not to obey. As Zane advanced into the arena, the apex predator lowered its head, its muscles rippling with power. It was a beast, a creation of war. Its fur was sleek, its claws sharp as daggers. It was an image of power, and yet in that moment, it felt something different, something unexpected. The beast seemed to hesitate, as though it were waiting for something. Liora stepped forward, unable to contain her curiosity. Why wasn't the apex predator attacking? It should have been tearing into the cadet by now. This wasn't like any battle I had seen before. And then she saw it. The predator's eyes flickered toward her, its gaze locking onto hers for a brief moment. In that instant, she knew the predator wasn't just fighting out of instinct. It was waiting for something more. It was waiting for a choice. "Zane, move in!" the general barked, his voice cold and commanding. But Zane hesitated, sensing the change in the air. The apex predator wasn't just a beast to be slaughtered. It was something else, something alive. Liora took a deep breath, stepping into the light of the arena. She could feel the eyes of the Empire on her, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders. She was different, and they would never understand. The apex predator turned its head to Liora once again, and for the first time, Liora saw something that she had never expected. The creature's choice. It wasn't just a machine. It was alive, with a mind of its own, and it had chosen her. The sun had barely begun to set when Liora found herself standing before the apex predator's containment cell once again. The world outside was bathed in a cold, unforgiving light, But here, inside the academy, the air was thick with tension. The sounds of distant training exercises echoed through the cold, sterile halls, a constant reminder of the Empire's reach. Yet here she stood, alone. Liora's fingers brushed lightly against the cold metal of the control panel. The creatures she studied, the apex predators, were tools of war, bred and conditioned to obey commands without question. But she had always seen something more in them. They were alive, not just machines, and they deserved a chance to choose. Her mind raced as she thought of the Empire's control over her work. She was constantly being told that her ideas were idealistic, impractical, that these creatures were nothing more than weapons. But Liora had spent countless hours studying the creatures, and she knew what the Empire refused to acknowledge. These beings, these predators, were not just born to kill. They were born to live, to choose, to trust. Her heart pounded as she remembered the general's words earlier that day. The apex predator is a tool. It is not a companion. It is not a friend. It is a weapon and nothing more. But Liora had always known there was more to it than that. The creatures could feel, they could sense, and now the apex predator was standing at the crossroads between obedience and freedom. But here, inside the academy, freedom was a luxury few had. Liora was a scientist, yes, but that title didn't matter here. Not to the general, and certainly not to the rest of the Empire. They saw her as weak for believing that these creatures deserved something beyond their purpose as weapons. She had been labeled a failure, not because of her intellect, but because of her ideals. The Empire's methods were simple: obedience, control, fear. And Liora had constantly challenged that. She had tried to find ways to make the creatures trust. She had tried to show them that they could be more than tools, they could be partners. But every time she got close to success, the Empire stepped in. They shut her down, calling her methods unconventional, reckless, even dangerous. But the cubs, the predators, had chosen her, not out of fear, but because they saw something in her that no one else had. She had earned their trust. But now, as she stood before the apex predator, Liora wasn't sure if that would be enough. The general had made his decision, and she was simply a tool in their grand plan. The Empire's plan was clear. The apex predator was meant to serve, nothing more. She turned her back to the glass and glanced toward the distant windows. Outside, the sun was setting, casting an eerie glow over the academy's landscape. A cold breeze stirred the air and she shivered slightly. The wind carried a whisper of freedom, a reminder of what the Empire had taken from them all. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She could no longer accept the way the Empire had built its machinery of war, its tools of control. The general's rules were suffocating her, suffocating the apex predator and everything she had tried to build. Hope was an illusion, a lie they had forced her to believe. But that illusion was fading. As she turned back to the control panel, her hand trembled slightly. What if this was it? What if this was the end of her work, her beliefs, and her fight against the system that had boxed her in? What if the Empire was right? What if the apex predator could only be a tool of destruction? Liora closed her eyes and breathed deeply, trying to steady her racing thoughts. The truth was, she was alone. The general had no faith in her methods. The Empire would never support her vision of a world where beasts and humans could coexist. It wasn't in their nature, and it never would be. But that didn't mean Liora was done. She couldn't let it end like this. She couldn't stand by and watch these creatures, these living, breathing beings, be reduced to weapons once again. The general was wrong, and so was the Empire. The apex predator could be more than a tool. It could be part of something greater, something they hadn't considered. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside the room. The door slid open and a familiar face appeared, Lieutenant Harrow, a junior officer in the academy. He looked worried, his brow furrowed. "Liora," he said, his voice hushed. "The general is calling for the mission. He wants the apex predator released now." Liora's heart sank. It was happening. The Empire had decided the predator's fate, and soon it would be on the hunt, sent to destroy rather than choose. "I'm not ready," she whispered, more to herself than to Harrow. But he didn't seem surprised. "You've tried, Liora. We all have. But this is how things are now. The Empire will never accept your vision. It's too..." He paused, trying to find the right words. Too idealistic." Liora felt a surge of frustration. Idealistic? Was that really all it was? Did the Empire really think that everything could be solved with fear and obedience? Did they truly believe that trust, compassion, and loyalty were so weak? But Liora knew what she had to do. She had made her choice. She would stand by her vision no matter the consequences. The cubs had chosen her, and she would fight for them no matter what it took. The general's orders didn't matter. The Empire's control didn't matter. She would make her own way. And as she stepped forward, her heart filled with resolve. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Liora stood in the observation room, her hands clenched around the cold steel railing as she stared at the apex predator below. The beast paced nervously in its containment cell, its muscular body rippling with each movement. For months, she had watched it, studied it, believed in its potential for choice. But now, in this moment, with the Empire's mission looming over them all, she wasn't sure anymore. Would the apex predator follow its programming, or would it make a different decision? The general's orders were clear. The apex predator was to be unleashed on the human target, a test of its obedience to the Empire's command. The humans, the cadets, the soldiers, they were all waiting for the moment when the beast would obey, when it would be the weapon it was designed to be. But what if it chose not to? The door to the training arena opened with a mechanical hiss, and Zane, a cadet known for his cold efficiency, stepped inside. He wore the traditional uniform, a weapon slung over his shoulder. His expression was grim, his eyes narrowed in concentration. The Empire had chosen him as the one to face the predator, the one to prove that even the apex predator could be controlled. Liora swallowed hard as she watched Zane approach the apex predator's containment. She knew what was about to happen. She knew that the Empire expected the predator to kill, to be unleashed like a tool of destruction. The Empire had never given these creatures the chance to decide for themselves. They were tools, nothing more. But that was the lie Liora had always fought against. These creatures were not just mindless machines. They were alive, capable of thought, of feeling, and of choosing their own path. The moment the apex predator saw Zane entering the arena, it froze. Its intense gaze locked onto him, and for a split second, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment where its fate would be decided. Would it fight, as it was trained to do, or would it make a different decision? The general's orders were clear. The apex predator was to be unleashed on the human target, a test of its obedience to the Empire's command. The humans, the cadets, the soldiers, they were all waiting for the moment when the beast would obey, when it would be the weapon it was designed to be. But what if it chose not to? The door to the training arena opened with a mechanical hiss, and Zane, a cadet known for his cold efficiency, stepped inside. He wore the traditional uniform, a weapon slung over his shoulder. His expression was grim, his eyes narrowed in concentration. The Empire had chosen him as the one to face the predator, the one to prove that even the apex predator could be controlled. Liora swallowed hard as she watched Zane approach the apex predator's containment. She knew what was about to happen. She knew that the Empire expected the predator to kill, to be unleashed like a tool of destruction. The Empire had never given these creatures the chance to decide for themselves. They were tools, nothing more. But that was the lie Liora had always fought against. These creatures were not just mindless machines. They were alive, capable of thought, of feeling, and of choosing their own path. The moment the apex predator saw Zane entering the arena, it froze. Its intense gaze locked onto him, and for a split second, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment where its fate would be decided. Would it fight, as it was trained to do, or would it make a different decision? The general's orders echoed in the observation room. "Release the beast," he commanded, his tone cold, calculated. Liora stepped back, trying to steady her breathing. "Please," she whispered under her breath, "choose the right path." With a loud mechanical whir, the containment doors slid open. The apex predator moved toward Zane with calculated steps, its massive form cutting through the air like a shadow of death. The cadet raised his weapon, but the creature didn't attack. It stopped just short of Zane, its eyes narrowing as if it were measuring him, calculating its next move. For a heartbeat, everything was still. The predator and the cadet stood in silence, the tension so thick it felt like the air might crack open. Zane stood firm, though his hands were trembling ever so slightly. "What's happening?" the general muttered under his breath, his eyes darting between the predator and the cadet. Suddenly, without warning, the apex predator made its decision. Instead of attacking, it moved to the side, positioning itself between Zane and Liora, its body blocking any path. The beast let out a low, rumbling growl, its teeth flashing, but it didn't strike. It stood its ground, a defiant challenge to the Empire's control. The room fell silent. No one had anticipated this. The general looked like he had been struck by a physical blow. He stepped forward, his eyes wild with disbelief. "What is this?" he shouted. The cubs, those once subjugated creatures, had chosen loyalty over obedience. They had chosen trust over fear. They were no longer tools to be wielded at will. In that moment, the Empire's power began to unravel. Zane, unsure of what to do, slowly lowered his weapon. The tension in the room was unbearable. The cub's loyalty was no longer a concept, it was a reality. And it wasn't just the apex predator. As Zane hesitated, more cubs stepped forward, circling the human cadet and forming a protective line in front of him. The general looked on stunned. His eyes flicked to the screens as the cubs' behavior continued to shift. They weren't attacking, they were protecting, forming a barrier between the humans and the threats. "No, this is wrong," the general shouted, his voice cracking under the pressure. "They're not supposed to protect, they're supposed to obey." But the cubs weren't listening. They didn't obey anymore. They had chosen their path, and that path was defying the Empire. Liora could hardly believe what she was seeing. The cubs, her cubs, the creatures that she had been fighting for, had finally seen the truth. They were alive, not just tools to be used. They were choosing freedom, and by doing so, they were taking their first steps towards defying their makers. The room buzzed with confusion, with shock. Zane, realizing the shift in the atmosphere, slowly backed away from the cubs, retreating toward the safety of the observation room. He was no longer needed to fight. The cubs had made their choice, and it was clear. They had chosen Liora's way. The Empire's system had failed, and the cubs had proven it. They were no longer just predators. They were creatures capable of choice, and they had chosen to stand with Liora. The arena was in chaos. Liora stood at the back of the observation room, her fingers gripping the metal railing as she tried to process what had just happened. The cubs, those genetically engineered war machines, had defied the Empire's orders. And they hadn't just disobeyed, they had actively chosen to protect the humans, to protect her. The general, standing beside her, seethed with anger. His fists clenched at his sides, his breathing shallow. He couldn't comprehend what had just occurred. Cubs didn't choose. They were created to follow, to obey. They were tools, not beings with autonomy. "What just happened?" the general barked, his voice tight with frustration. He shot a look at the monitors, where the apex predator and the other cubs were now surrounding Zane, who had no choice but to retreat. "They chose." Liora's voice was steady, but filled with disbelief. "They chose to stand with us, not against us." The general turned sharply to face her, his eyes narrowing in rage. "You failed, Liora!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "You've turned them into your allies. This is treason!" Liora swallowed hard, holding his gaze. "No, General. This is the future. A future where creatures and humans can work together, not as enemies, but as equals." "You're delusional," the general spat. "You think you can change them? You think they can choose their destiny? They are nothing but tools." The tension between them was palpable.
the Empire's rigidity clashing against Liora's vision of a new world. The Empire had built its empire on control, on fear, and on using creatures as tools. Liora had tried to show them another way, but now the creatures were showing her that they were ready to embrace her vision. "You've lost control," Liora said quietly, her voice firm. "The cubs have chosen a path of their own, and they've chosen us." The general fumed, turning away from her. His eyes flicked over the arena, where the cubs continued to form a protective circle around Zane. He couldn't understand it. The Empire's system had been so foolproof. It had always worked, until now. But even as the general raged, he knew that something larger was at play here. The cubs had broken free of their conditioning, and the Empire wasn't prepared for it. Outside the arena, there was an eerie silence that had overtaken the usual chaotic hum of the Academy's halls. Cadets gathered in small groups, whispering in hushed voices as they watched the screens. The word spread quickly. The cubs had chosen to protect the human. They had defied the Empire's authority in favor of something they had never known: loyalty, understanding, and trust. Liora watched through the window as cadets filed out of the arena, their faces etched with disbelief and confusion. They had been taught to view the cubs as tools of war, bred to serve the Empire. But now the cubs had chosen to protect, to serve a cause other than the Empire's goals. The Academy was on the brink of a breakthrough, but the Empire wasn't ready to embrace it. "Liora, what are you doing?" Lieutenant Harrow's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He stood beside her, watching the chaos unfold. "The general won't stand for this. You've turned the cubs against the Empire. This could mean everything changes." Liora turned to face her, her expression soft but resolute. "I haven't turned them, Harrow. They've chosen on their own, and now we need to show the world what that choice means." He looked at her, uncertainty flashing in his eyes. "And what if the Empire comes for us? Then we stand together," she said firmly. "The Empire has always relied on fear and force, but now they're about to learn that there's something stronger than control: choice." Back in the main arena, the general had finally regained his composure, but the rage on his face hadn't faded. He stood with his officers, glaring at the screens, as the cubs continued to shield Zane. The scene had turned from a battle to a standoff, and the soldiers around him seemed unsure what to do. "What now, General?" one of his officers asked hesitantly. "The cubs are not obeying. They're not attacking. They're just standing there." "They're waiting," the general muttered, his eyes narrowing. He clenched his fists, his eyes flashing with rage. "Get me the reinforcements. We're taking control of this situation, now." But as his soldiers moved to follow his orders, the cubs didn't budge. They remained in place, their eyes never leaving Zane. They were a living barricade, a silent declaration of rebellion. The Empire's strength had always been its power to dominate, its ability to control. But now, for the first time, it was being questioned by something that had never been allowed to question: a beast.
The silence that followed was deafening. In the heart of the Academy, where control and dominance were the only rules, something profound had occurred. Liora's gaze remained fixed on the apex predator, whose powerful form still stood in front of Zane. Its massive body was poised, but it didn't attack. Instead, it looked calm, almost regal, standing between Zane and the rest of the Empire's soldiers. For a moment, there was no sound, except the faint hum of the energy shields that surrounded the arena. Then, ever so slowly, the apex predator turned its head to look directly at Liora. Liora's heart skipped a beat. There was something in its eyes, a depth, a calm understanding, as if the creature had made a decision. This wasn't just a beast, it was alive, with its own emotions, its own thoughts. It had chosen her, just as she had hoped, just as she had believed. Zane stood in the background, still unsure of what to do. The other cadets and soldiers, who had watched in stunned silence, were now murmuring to each other, questioning the events unfolding before their eyes. The apex predator was not attacking, but it was not retreating either. It had made its choice, and that choice was clear. It was standing with Liora. "It's waiting for you," Harrow whispered, his voice filled with awe. "It's waiting for you to make the next move." Liora took a deep breath. The weight of the situation pressed down on her chest, but she knew what had to be done. She had worked for this moment for so long, but now, it was no longer about proving a point or challenging the system. It was about trust. The trust between her and the cubs. The trust that they had chosen her and she was choosing them in return. She took a slow step forward, her eyes never leaving the apex predator. The creature, which had been bred for one purpose alone, now stood at the crossroads between obedience and free will. And as she stepped closer, Liora felt her heart beat faster. This was the moment when everything would change, for both of them. "It's okay," Liora said softly, her voice filled with emotion. She reached out a hand, her fingers trembling. "You don't have to fight anymore." The apex predator didn't move immediately, but its eyes softened, a faint recognition flickering in them. It understood her. And then, just as Liora's hand was inches from the predator's face, something remarkable happened. The creature lowered its head just slightly, in a gesture that could only be interpreted as acceptance. As if it were acknowledging her, the one person who had treated it with respect and understanding, not as a tool, but as a living being. The bond was forged in that moment, between a human and a predator, two beings who had learned to trust one another. Liora's hand touched the predator's scaled skin, and the warmth that radiated from it was unlike anything she had ever felt before. The creature, once a cold and emotionless weapon, now seemed almost gentle under her touch. "You've chosen," she whispered, almost to herself, her voice thick with emotion. "You've chosen not to fight, not to destroy, but to protect, to trust." The apex predator gave a low, grumbling growl, not one of aggression, but one of recognition. It was choosing her, just as she had chosen it. They were no longer enemies, no longer opposites forced into a fight. They were allies, bound by a shared sense of understanding, of mutual respect. And then, as if to affirm her belief, the apex predator turned its head slightly and looked at Zane, who still stood in the background, his weapon lowered in disbelief. The cubs had surrounded him, standing guard like silent sentinels, their eyes unwavering. Zane was no longer a threat. He was a witness to what was happening here. This was no longer a battle between predator and prey. This was a battle for something more, the choice to stand together, not as enemies, but as partners. Liora took another step, her voice breaking the silence. "You don't have to obey them. You don't have to follow their orders. You've made your choice." The cubs, who had once been feared, controlled, and exploited, had now chosen to stand with the human. And in that moment, Liora realized something monumental. The creatures had been waiting for her to believe in them, to see them as more than just tools of war. She had always believed they could be more than tools. She had always believed they could choose to be better, to be more than just agents of destruction. And now, they had chosen to be something more. They had chosen to be partners, to fight alongside her, to protect her, and to trust her. "Thank you," Liora whispered, her voice full of emotion. She couldn't say more. She had no words to express the depth of what she felt in that moment. And as the apex predator stepped closer, its powerful body moving with grace and precision, Liora felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. They were ready. Together, they would challenge the Empire. They would no longer be weapons. They would no longer be controlled. They would be free. And in that moment, Liora knew that she was no longer fighting for the cubs, or even for herself. She was fighting for something greater, for a future where humans and creatures could coexist, where trust and freedom would be their strength. And nothing, not the Empire, not the General, and certainly not the old system, could ever take that away from them again.
The arena was still. The air had thickened with anticipation. The Empire's soldiers stood rigid, their eyes flickering with uncertainty as they watched the cubs circle Liora. The apex predator stood firm, its enormous form casting an imposing shadow over the small human figure. Liora felt the weight of the moment settle over her like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just a rebellion against the Empire's control. It was something much larger, something that would change everything. The Empire had spent centuries building its system of fear, its rules of obedience, and its tools of control. They'd bred the apex predators, twisted their genetics, forced them into submission, and trained them to be killing machines. They had created them to serve, to obey, and to destroy without hesitation. But today, something had changed. Today, the beasts that had been forced into a life of obedience had made a choice. They had chosen to protect. They had chosen freedom, and by doing so, they had challenged the foundation of the Empire's power. Liora could feel it. The Empire was no longer in control. Their grip on the apex predators had slipped, and with it, their control over the entire system. The cubs were just the beginning. They had shown her that it was possible, that change could happen not through fear or force, but through trust, loyalty, and understanding. Liora looked at the apex predator, its powerful eyes fixed on her. It was waiting. It had chosen her. And as the general paced back and forth behind her, his face contorted in rage and disbelief, Liora knew that this was just the start. The Empire was starting to realize that their most powerful weapon had turned against them. It wasn't just the cubs, it was the human spirit, the desire for choice, and the fight for freedom. And Liora, standing at the center of it all, understood the magnitude of what was at stake. As the general barked out orders, trying to regain control over the apex predator, Liora couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the precipice of something monumental. The Empire had spent centuries controlling and manipulating, but now they were faced with an unexpected rebellion. The apex predator wasn't just fighting for survival, it was fighting for its right to choose. "We have to act now," Liora thought to herself, her pulse racing. The cubs had made their decision. They had chosen to defy the Empire. But what would happen next? Would the Empire crush this small act of rebellion? Or would the apex predators and the humans continue to fight back, rise up against the Empire's reign? As she stood there, her eyes meeting the apex predators, she felt the weight of the responsibility settle on her shoulders. The war had already begun, but it wasn't just about the beasts anymore. It was about everyone who had been forced to obey, to follow blindly. It was about humanity's choice, about showing the Empire that there was more to life than fear and control. The general turned to face Liora, his eyes blazing with fury. "You've made a mistake," he spat. "You've allowed them to choose, and now you'll pay for it." Liora stood her ground, refusing to let his anger intimidate her. "This isn't a mistake. This is the future. It's happening, whether you like it or not." The general's hands tightened into fists. He had always believed in the Empire's control. He had trusted that it was impossible to break. But now he was seeing the truth. The Empire's control wasn't unbreakable. The apex predator had chosen something that was not part of the Empire's plan, and that choice had set everything in motion. As the general stormed out of the observation room, Liora couldn't help but feel the shift in the air. The Empire had underestimated the power of choice, and now they were about to pay the price. The cubs had shown her that trust, loyalty, and the willingness to fight for something better were the true sources of strength. But this wasn't just about proving a point anymore. This was about the future of the world. The apex predators were no longer just tools. They were beings with a purpose that had been hidden from them, but now they had found it. They had chosen to protect humans, and in doing so, they had started a chain reaction that would change the world forever.
The Empire's system was crumbling. It had been built on the backs of creatures bred for obedience, on fear and control, on the idea that the Empire was invincible, that it could subdue anything, anyone. But as the apex predator stood at Liora's side, it was clear the Empire had been wrong. The creatures, the beasts, weren't tools to be used and discarded. They were partners, capable of loyalty and understanding, a power that the Empire had never accounted for. Liora stood in the heart of the Empire's citadel, watching as the apex predator and the cubs surrounded her. The general's once imposing figure was now reduced to a shadow of his former self, his power dwindling as his empire faced a rebellion it hadn't foreseen. The power had shifted.
Now, the apex predator was not the Empire's weapon. It was Liora's ally, her partner. The cubs stood behind her, their loyalty evident in their eyes, their bodies poised to defend her if needed. This was no longer a world where the Empire controlled everything. The apex predator, the very creature that had once been used to enforce the Empire's rule, had chosen her. The bond between human and beast had grown beyond the surface of their bond. It was now unshakable, a testament to what true trust could accomplish. Liora stood in the heart of the Empire citadel, watching as the apex predator and the cubs surrounded her. The general's once imposing figure was now reduced to a shadow of his former self, his power dwindling as his empire faced a rebellion it hadn't foreseen. The power had shifted. Now the apex predator was not the Empire's weapon, it was Liora's ally, her partner. The cubs stood behind her, their loyalty evident in their eyes, their bodies poised to defend her if needed. This was no longer a world where the Empire controlled everything. The apex predator, the very creature that had once been used to enforce the Empire's rule, had chosen her. The bond between human and beast had grown beyond the surface of their bond. It was now unshakable, a testament to what true trust could accomplish. The general stood at the gates of the observation chamber, watching as Liora moved forward, her gaze steady, her steps confident. "What have you done?" The general's voice cracked with frustration, a tremor of fear seeping into his usually rigid tone. He had never known such defiance. The Empire's control had always been absolute, but now it was slipping away. "What I've done," Liora replied, her voice calm yet filled with undeniable strength, "is show them that we have a choice." The apex predator let out a low growl in agreement, stepping forward to stand beside her, its massive frame towering over the general. The predator's eyes burned with a new purpose. It had chosen its path, and that path led it to Liora. "This is treason," the general muttered, his voice strained as he watched the apex predator growl menacingly in his direction. But Liora wasn't afraid. She didn't need to raise her voice. She had already shown that understanding and loyalty were more powerful than fear. "It's not treason," Liora said, her voice steady and unyielding. "It's freedom." The general's eyes darted from Liora to the cubs, their fierce gaze unwavering, their loyalty to their human companion more than evident. For the first time, the Empire's power felt fragile, even weak. Behind her, the soldiers of the Empire were gathering, ready to impose their rule once again. But Liora wasn't afraid. The apex predator, the cubs, and the humans who stood with her were no longer slaves to the Empire's control. They had chosen a new future, a future of partnership, of choice. And Liora could feel the weight of that future pressing forward, unfolding before her eyes. "You've lost," Liora whispered, her words cutting through the general's resolve. "You've lost because you thought you could control everything. But the real strength lies in choice, in trust." The general was silent, his lips trembling in anger. "You've brought the Empire's downfall, Liora. This rebellion will destroy everything." Liora shook her head, a soft smile forming on her lips. "No, General. The Empire's downfall was inevitable. The rebellion isn't the end. It's the beginning of something better." The cubs, once treated as tools of destruction, now stood with the humans, ready to fight for a future where they were no longer manipulated, no longer subjugated to the Empire's whims. The Empire had always believed that the power of control could sustain them, that fear was the only tool they needed. But the apex predator, the cubs, and Liora had shown them the truth. The real power lay in partnership, in understanding, and in the ability to choose. As the apex predator let out a mighty roar, the Empire's guards began to retreat. Their control had failed. They had been faced with something stronger than their military might, loyalty and trust. The cubs had chosen to stand with Liora, and in doing so, they had defied the Empire's iron grip. The apex predator,
once a tool of destruction, was now a symbol of rebellion.